Hello and welcome to the Hoover Institution's 2015 Spring Retreat. I'm Chris Dower, Hoover's Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Our speakers in this chartcast are Douglas Rivers, a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, and David Brady, the Davies Family Senior Fellow at Hoover and the Bowen H. and Janice Arthur McCoy Professor of Political Science at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. The title of their talk is Polling on Policy, and it was recorded on April 20th, 2015.
Thank you very much. This is a new policy initiative at Hoover Institution. It's called Polling and Policy, and this institution not possible without two people, one John Razian, but number two is Doug Rivers, who founded, among three companies that I know he founded, YouGov, our Polymetrics, which was sold to YouGov. And Polymetrics is the first internet polling firm to be accepted by both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times as accurate over elections and other matters. Now, why is that important? It's important because most of the time when we do a poll, it's just a one-time snapshot. You get 1,000 people, roughly, and you got a plus or minus 3% error. So we can say how the that the margins change over time, but we really can't say very much about how individuals are changing because we don't have the same individuals. With this policy initiative, we have the same individuals, and I'm going to talk about this. So we have the same individuals, so we can actually measure change over time. And because we have the same individuals, we know a lot more about them as we move from time one to time two. So what we're trying to do today is give you a little flavor of what these projects are. And it's an initiative we just started. So let me start with this. You've seen this poll before. We've talked about it. We talked about this as a period of great electoral instability. From 2000 to 2004, the Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And then, of course, in 2006, the House and Senate went Democrat, and then 2008, we know the results of that election. 2010, the House switches. 2014, then again 2012. A lot of flip-flopping, tremendous instability in the American electorate. The only other period of instability at the same level is 1874 to 1896. And even though my students would never agree to it, even I was not born then. So, although they think so. So the question is, what accounts for this tremendous amount of instability? And the answer is that in both periods we were undergoing the great transformation of the world economy. The first transformation occurred led by the British, but then the United States picked up after the Civil War, and by 1896 the United States was the most powerful industrial country in the world. But the second, the period that we're presently in, is an even greater industrial transformation, economic transformation, because this time China, India, and Asia are in, so that roughly 3/4 of the world are now in under the new capitalist system, and countries in the United States is facing some difficulty about how to deal with this. A couple of economists here at Stanford, Nick Bloom and Steve Davis at Chicago, have come up with something called a Policy Instability Index. So one of the things that that we're doing on this on the policy and polling is we have polls in the United States, Canada, Korea, Italy, Germany, Denmark, Canada, and France. And probably we're going to go into Belgium and a couple other countries. But at this point, we have those 8 polls. And we're able to ask in a poll the same way we can in the U.S., the same sorts of people. So the first thing is we begin with this notion of Nick Bloom and Steve Davis at Chicago. Nick Bloom here at Stanford's Economics have a group called the Economics Political Stability. So here are the bad economies in Europe, France, Greece, Italy, and Spain over the last time period. And you can see that beginning about 75, 80, there's a tremendous amount of political instability. in those bad economies. In the good economies, we know there's some political instability, but still not as much as in the bad economies. So the point is, we have a political stability, we have political instability measures, and this is the Steve Davis and Nick Bloom stuff on economic policy uncertainty index. And the various points you can, at every point, I'm not going to go through all of the points on the thing, but each of those dots would represent some one point in this time series where an event occurred, and we can point to that as creating some political instability. So there's one for September 9/11, 2001, etc. But the point I want to make broadly today is that the political instability and the economic instability index are in fact related to each other. Now, how are they related? We're able to show, in the following, you look at this chart, in the arrow that the good economies, Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, the good economies have, compared to the bad economies, beginning in the 1980s, outperformed them in terms of growth and economics. So we know that economic growth and development is tied to both political and economic instability. Now, the way in which that's done, we're not prepared at this point to give an answer to that because we're just beginning the process. But let me point out, in the UK, a system which has been the standard for two parties, Tories versus Labour. Beginning about a decade ago, you got a third party involved. In this time, there are 5-6 parties competing in the British elections that can gain votes, including UKIP, the Conservative Party doesn't want the UN, Green Party. And the point is that in every country in the world, political and economic stability is at stake. Things are changing. And we hope that this project is a way for us to begin to get a handle on that. So let me show you, we just got the first result of surveys. I don't have the stuff yet for Italy. But one of the questions that's involved is the U.S., what you often see in the press is the U.S. is on its way to being like Europe? Can we provide some answers to that question? Well, here's one. Should government own businesses? Well, as you can see, even in Italy, they think no. France, 58% yes. And in the U.S., you can see the U.S. and Britain are more closely put together on the grounds. No, the government shouldn't own those things. Let's push another sort of issue. Here's a fair income tax rate. Now, this is fairly amazing. So if you look down, here's the U.S. This is a fair income tax. What should the fair income tax be at different levels? If you make 25,000 US dollars or 25,000 euros, family of 4, 50, 80, and 800,000. Well, the amazing thing is, so if you have a family of 4 that makes 800,000 in the US, people believe that the tax rate should be 26%. In the UK, I believe it should be 41%. In France, 35%. And in Italy, 35%. And all of those are well below California. If you pay income taxes in California, you're over 50%. By the time you add them all in, you're about 54%. If you're in that final category, people actually believe you should pay half of what you pay in this. So it's not, so with a set of questions like this, we're beginning to try and get some answers to the question of where are we relative to the Europeans. And now for the first time, we're going to be able to compare in a direct way because we're asking everybody exactly the same set of questions. And it's the same panel, so we can see over time what the effects are. So one other interesting thing we can do here is we can place the political parties from all these countries on a left-right scale. So you can see on income inequality, the U.S. Democratic Party is the furthest left party, and the Republican Party, so the question is, government should reduce income inequality on the left, and on the right, government should let people get ahead on their own. And you can see that the Republican Party is more conservative than the UK Conservative Party, and the Democratic Party on that issue is more liberal. Should government own businesses like car manufacturers, airlines, and banks? You can see there that some other parties are further right and further left. But the point of the essay is not to go on and give you an answer to that question, but for the first time, we're going to be able to begin to analyze those questions over 8 countries and begin to track exactly how political instability, policy instability is affecting economic growth across those 8 countries. Now, the second example I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to Doug is the 47%, which you're all familiar with, the 47% that get some form of federal aid. Now, the question is that 47% didn't play very well in the press last time, as you remember, in the 2012 election. So because we have the kind of sample we have, we're able to go in, and this is a preliminary estimate. We want to know who the 47% are, what exactly did they get from the federal government, how do they get it, how do they use it, how do they vote, what effect does it have? And so I'll begin with, and again, we just started this project about 4 months ago, so I'm just giving you the first results of the first survey. So as you can see from this, we chose federal programs that go from heavily used to less heavily used. So unemployment insurance is the first one, and you can see that about 48% of Americans say they have used unemployment insurance. Someone in there, the question reads, do you know anyone in your immediate family that has received unemployment insurance? Has anyone in your household ever received any of the following? So 48% have received unemployment. Food stamps drops to 34%. Special supplement, WIC drops to 23%. Finally down to needy families, which is at 9%. So we started out by asking who gets these things? Who gets the money? We see that it's a pretty good estimate. We know who gets them and who doesn't, follows this particular pattern. So here's the Democrats, Independent, and Republican on who gets unemployment. And you can see that on the unemployment dimension, there's no difference, real difference between Democrats and Republicans. And that seems to us to make perfect sense. If you're unemployed, if you have a job and you're unemployed, people take unemployment benefits. That seems pretty straightforward, and there's not much difference between Democrats and Republicans. So we thought we'd test that a little further. So we looked at support for the Tea Party, level for support for the Tea Party, and whether anyone in the family had taken it. So if you look at that, if you strongly support, people who strongly support the Tea Party's goals, yes, some have taken unemployment. If you somewhat support them, even more have taken it. And that, again, seems to make sense on the grounds that if you have a job and you don't have a job and you have a family, you take unemployment insurance. The rest of that seems, it just seems straightforward. Now, what about food stamps? Well, here on the food stamps, you begin to see a pretty big difference. Democrats are about twice as likely to have someone in their family have been on food stamps as not been on it. So you see that, you can see on the top part, Democrats are here, Republicans are there, with independents as usual being in the middle. So as we move down the program, you get partisan differences. That's just a table that shows this. This is the government assistance. This is the WIC program. And here again, you can see that Democrats are more likely to take this than Republicans, but the number of people actually on the program and benefiting from it drops as you move down that level. And the second part, this part in here, is just the no's, so you see more Republicans out there. I never thought what a terrible angle this is to try and point anything out, so I'll just point it back in there. You pretend I'm pointing it at what's relevant. So Social Security disability. Now that's a very costly program, and again, you can see that the numbers of people taking it have dropped, and Republicans take it considerably less often than do Democrats. Those are the sorts of things that we would expect. And finally, when you get down to temporary assistance for needy families, the answer is Democrats outnumber Republicans, but the numbers are quite small. So the first thing that appears from this, what is the 47%? Now, we don't have that. On unemployment, we don't yet know how long people are on unemployment. That's a crucial variable. It's not that you're on it, it's the question of how long you're on it. We don't know that yet, but that's the idea of being able to provide this over time data series that will be able to answer questions like that. How long have you been on it? Now, here's another thing that points out. On government assistance, unemployment, men are more likely to take it than women. And in the most recent past recession, men were much more likely to suffer unemployment as women were. And as you can see, the number of men taking unemployment is greater than the number of women. When you drop down to the other programs, now this is male versus female differences on food stamps, you see that females are much more likely, single mothers are much more likely to be on food stamps than men. When you get down to supplemental nutrition for women and children, the differences are male-female, and again, finally on supplement nutrition programs, same thing. So the programs make sense on who's on them and who's not. Now, you come to some. I'm going to finish with some of the differences, perceived differences on these. First question is, should you feel ashamed if you're on welfare? There are differences between, so this is a question that just asks, should you feel ashamed if you have to take welfare? Now note that Democrats should not, overwhelming Democrats should not feel afraid. Independents are about 60%, should not feel ashamed. But even Republicans are at 50% on you should not feel ashamed. Higher percentage say they should, but nevertheless, there's not much difference on there's some differences, but the differences on the shame question are not as big as you might have predicted. Now, people on welfare should be able to decide how they spend the money they receive. Democrats are about 40% yes, independents are about 25%, and Republicans are only about 10%, i.e., they shouldn't be able, if you're receiving welfare, you shouldn't be able to determine how you use it. And you can see that the government should restrict what people can do. Republicans are more likely to say, if you're on welfare, the government should restrict what you're able to do with that. And so here's some specifics. A couple of states have passed rules that say limit welfare. If you're on welfare, you're limited cash withdrawals at $25 a day. And so you can see on that about 40% of Republicans support that, about 35% disagree, and Democrats oppose that notion. So there are, in short, differences. Here's another one on drug tests. If you test positive for drugs, should you lose your welfare benefits? Democrats are about 50-30, no. Republicans are about 90-10, yes, you should lose your benefits. So on the question of both in terms of political stability, policy instability in Europe, the United States, Korea, and the countries we have thus far put together, we believe we're on the way to having a time series that will actually tell us something about how those things and how political instability affects GDP, growth, the economy. And second, in regard to the question of the 47%, we believe that within 2 or 3 years, we're going to have a very good time series on exactly who gets what, how long they're on it, how much they get, and in the long run, how does that affect, or how do they behave politically, and over time, does that change, and do people's opinions of that change? We're not in a position at this point to give answers to those questions, but given the technology that we have, we are in a position to be able to say we should be able to be there within 2 or 3 years, have a pretty good picture, and the longer we're at it, the better our picture will be. Thank you, Doug.
So as Dave said, this is a non-traditional polling project. We're trying to ask questions that aren't normally asked in media polls. The idea is that policies are more complex than what can typically be explained in a soundbite on television, and too much of media polling is superficial and uninformative about policy itself. Knowing that people are for or against inequality or high taxes or wasteful government spending doesn't get you very far. So a bit of what we're doing is finding out what people understand about these issues, where the gaps are in their understanding, and how they might be persuaded when they have mistaken positions. So let me start with Social Security. So we all know that the Social Security Trust Fund is fast being depleted, but most voters are of essentially the what me worry school of Social Security policy. The belief among many policymakers in Washington is when the trust funds are depleted, there'll be mandatory cuts enforced. So we did something that's a little different than the typical Social Security poll. We told people what the Social Security actuaries say about when the trust funds will be depleted, and then asked about a specific set of policies, whether they oppose or favor them. And what we found was, first, don't hold your breath for mandatory cuts. I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but the second set of bars, those guys right there, are favoring cutting benefits. There's very little support for that, and when push comes to shove, I don't think that's going to happen. Another possibility is raising Social Security taxes. Not much support for that. Where there is support are these two things over here, which are reducing benefits for high-income retirees and increasing the contribution limit for high-income workers. And those things have huge amounts of support. And we think that when this issue gets forced on us, that politics is going to have a big impact on what actually happens. Let me move on to the tax system. This question here, this is a survey we conducted actually last week. The data is hot off the press. And this question is typical of a lot of questions that you'll see on surveys. How fair would you say our tax system is? And the answer is not very. Large majority of people think it's either very unfair or somewhat unfair. Very few think it's very fair. The problem is that doesn't really help you much understanding what policies people favor or not. You know, what exactly is unfair about it and why? So the conventional wisdom at the moment, particularly if you read the New York Times, is the solution to all of this is to raise taxes on high earners. We've done a series of studies. Dave showed you some of the data from our cross-national study, where we've tried to measure essentially what tax policies in fairly minute detail people favor. That is exactly what rates, what kind of deductions, and so forth. And we found just consistently across the world that people actually don't tend to favor the sort of rates that are being discussed. You know, there are people seriously proposing 70% top income tax rates. It was actually enacted in France. And there's very little support for that. But this is typical of the polling you'll see, which says that people think that there should be increases in terms of top rates. And this was tested actually quite extensively by the Obama campaign in 2008, and they came up with any number above about $150,000 a year is a safe number that will get majority support. And at $250,000, you essentially get almost a majority of Republicans favoring increases at that level. The problem is these questions are relative. We're asking people, should rates be raised or lowered relative to what they are now, not what rates they should be. And it turns out, though it's rarely been asked, people have very poor understanding of the current tax system. So we, in this survey, took a scenario of someone earning $1 million a year. That's high enough so that the marginal and average rates are about the same, since most voters don't understand the difference between those two things. I think you'll find the results interesting. So, So the first question is, do you think that someone who receives a salary of $1 million per year should pay more or less than under current law? And what you see is there's a partisan division. Democrats overwhelmingly think more or about the same. Republicans think less or about the same. But interestingly, overall, people are in favor of about the same as opposed to what they think they currently pay. So we followed up with 3 additional questions. We asked people what they think current law is. That is, how much does someone who earns $1 million a year pay in federal income tax? Secondly, how much do you think they actually pay as opposed to what the law states? And third, how much do you think they should pay? And the first thing you see here is asking people how much do you think they pay. The dots are the median guess. We asked people, if they didn't know, take your best guess. The median Democrat thinks that on $1 million of income, current law is $100,000 a year of taxes. Among independents and Republicans, the median number is on the order of about $250,000 or 25%. And the bars show the interquartile range. Okay? So there are quite a few people who have an interesting view of what the current statutory tax rates are. Okay. This is the distribution of answers. So the blue line is Democrats' answers, the red is Republican, and the purple is independents. So we'll keep that color scheme going throughout. And what you see is that the modal Democrat thinks that current law on $1 million of income is somewhere under $100,000 of tax owed. If this were climate change, they'd be called deniers. So I think those are the tax deniers. So the next question is, how much do you think people are actually paying? So this is the same setup, so the dots are the median amounts. And what we see here is, across the board, people think that the amount actually paid is about half of the amount specified under current law. The question wording here, unfortunately, is incorrect. So this is, we told people, as opposed to what law says they are supposed to pay, how much do you think they're actually paying? And what we see is widespread belief that people are paying much less than the actual rates. And there's the distribution again. Now you see there's quite a bit more agreement on this, that the bulk of the population believes that the amount actually paid by millionaire earners is relatively low. All right, and then finally we asked, what do you think taxes should be? What's the right amount, the fair amount for someone to pay? And the shocking thing here is how widespread the agreement is across the party groups. Democrats are a little higher. They think the right amount's about $200,000 a year. Independents are a little under, about 17–18% rate, and Republicans are 16–17%. But the gap between the partisans on what they think the rate should be are quite a bit smaller. What we have here is a difference of opinion about what actual tax rates are and how much people are paying. And there you can see the shape of the distributions here. And the modal amount for all 3 parties is somewhere between 10 and 20%, with a small number of people preferring much higher numbers. So what we notice here is that nobody thinks that a 70% rate is a fair rate. That's just not part of public opinion in America at the moment. You probably got enough of taxes last week, so I won't go on too much longer. But we also asked people about which deductions they take. And this was interesting. You know, the IRS doesn't correlate taxes with characteristics, political opinions of people. And what we found is that there's quite a bit of difference in the rate at which people itemize the returns and the particular deductions they take. So there's a small gap. It's on the order of about 5 to 7% of Republicans being more likely to itemize the returns and about 10 points more likely to have someone else prepare the returns for them. When we looked at deductions that people take, what we see is that Republicans are actually much more likely to take deductions than Democrats, even beyond the fact that they itemize at a higher rate. Our economist colleagues at Hoover are constantly harping on getting a consumption tax, broadening the base, lowering rates, and so forth, which requires people to give up their deductions. And that's essentially going to mean Republicans giving up deductions. There's also an interesting gap here in level of satisfaction with the tax system. So Democrats are the only group in society that are reasonably satisfied with the tax system at the moment. So the blue bar there, this thing right here, is 41% of Democrats are somewhat satisfied with the tax system today, and only 20% are very dissatisfied. This is an issue in which Republicans and independents tend to agree. Large fractions of them are somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with the tax system. That's a technical term for that is a wedge issue. And so the Republicans in recent years have lost a lot of ground on the tax issue, and these results suggest that it's a better issue than people have thought for a while. Finally, the sort of sacred cow of deductions is the home mortgage interest deduction. So we looked at this, and the general belief has been that there's no way you're going to get away taking away the home mortgage interest deduction, though we posed it with an explicit trade-off. Would you be willing to trade removal of that for lower rates? Now that's probably not very popular in California, but what you notice here is not a lot of difference between the party groups, and it's about 50-50. So it's actually probably less of a toxic issue than people have been thinking, though the fundamental problem with it is the people who don't take the deduction think giving up the deduction would be just fine, and those that take it tend to be opposed. Part of the challenge of tax policy. Well, this is just a taste of the sort of work we're doing. It's a new project, and we're looking forward to covering a whole range of policy issues and providing perspective on them that you don't currently get from the bulk of the polls. Oh, yeah, one other one I should mention, am I out of time, is some work done by our colleagues here at Hoover, Dan Kessler and Jonathan Rodden, on inequality. You may have heard there's a lot of talk about inequality these days. The president thinks it's a defining issue for our time. And so we ran some fairly detailed surveys to find out what it was people had in mind when you discussed inequality. And in particular, to distinguish between inequality, that is differences in income and wealth, and mobility, which is people's ability to change their income and wealth over the course of their lifetimes and their children's lifetimes. And what we found was an interesting pattern, which is that mobility trumps inequality almost universally. That yes, people are opposed to inequality, but what they're really opposed to is lack of mobility. And mobility, of course, is one place where the American economy performs better than a lot of other economies, even though we tend to have more inequality. Anyhow, thank you.
For more podcasts and chartcasts from the Hoover Institution, please visit hoover.org or Hoover's channels on iTunes, iTunes U, and Stitcher. I'm Chris Dower for the Hoover Institution. Thank you for listening.